A routine flight from New York to London becomes the stage for a shocking display of arrogance and prejudice. When a distinguished black woman takes her rightful seat in first class, she is met with suspicion, condescension, and ultimately, a humiliating public removal from the plane. The accuser, a wealthy, platinum-status passenger, watches with smug satisfaction. But they have all made a catastrophic mistake. What happens when the woman they just disrespected is not just another passenger, but the person who now holds their careers and the airline's very reputation in the palm of her hand? Stay tuned, as a lesson in power, respect, and karma is about to be delivered at 35,000 feet. Before we begin, comment where you are watching from today, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now let's get into it. The first-class cabin of American Airlines Flight 110 from JFK to Heathrow was a carefully curated bubble of tranquility. The hushed symphony of clinking glasses, the gentle hum of the Boeing 777's powerful engines, and the soft, ambient lighting were all designed to insulate its occupants from the chaos of the world they were leaving behind. For Dr. Imani Jackson, Seat 2A was more than just a comfortable chair. It was a sanctuary. At 48, Imani carried an aura of composed elegance that was earned, not inherited. Her sharp, tailored blazer and silk blouse were a testament to a life spent in boardrooms, but the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes told a story of a week that had been particularly grueling. She had just closed the most significant merger of her career, a multi-billion-dollar deal that had required 18-hour days and a level of mental chess that would exhaust even the most seasoned executive. This flight wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. 6 hours of uninterrupted peace before she started a new, even more demanding chapter of her life in London. She settled into the plush leather, the seat sighing as it molded to her frame. She'd already placed her worn leather briefcase containing documents that could reshape the transatlantic airline industry into the overhead bin. Now, she simply wanted to breathe. A flight attendant, a young woman with a bright, nervous smile named Chloe, approached her. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage? Some champagne, perhaps?" "That would be lovely, thank you, Chloe," Imani said, her voice a warm, low alto that made the young woman relax instantly. "Just water for now, please. Still or sparkling is fine." "Of course." As Chloe departed, Imani noticed the woman across the aisle in seat 2D watching her. The woman, probably in her late 50s, had perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a string of pearls at her throat, and a look on her face that was a mixture of appraisal and faint disapproval. She exuded an air of old money and unquestioned privilege. When their eyes met, the woman offered a smile so thin it could have cut glass before pointedly turning back to her copy of The Economist. Imani had seen that look 1,000 times. It was the silent question, the subtle once-over that assessed her clothes, her handbag, her very presence in a space like this. It was a look that said, "How did you get here?" For years, it had angered her. Then it had frustrated her. Now it mostly just tired her. She had nothing to prove. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and focused on the promise of quiet solitude. A few minutes later, another passenger boarded, a man fumbling with an oversized carry-on, and he inadvertently bumped into the woman in 2D. "Oh, for heaven's sake, watch it!" the woman snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. The man mumbled an apology and hurried on. The woman, whose name Imani would soon learn was Eleanor Vance, huffed and straightened her already immaculate cashmere wrap. She then flagged down Chloe with an impatient flick of her wrist. "Young lady," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin, "I'd like to see the manifest for this cabin, please." Chloe blinked, taken aback. "The manifest, ma'am? I'm not sure I'm authorized to show you that. Is there a problem with your seat?" Eleanor Vance gestured vaguely across the aisle toward Imani, who had now opened her eyes, a premonition of disturbance prickling at the back of her neck. "I believe there has been a mistake with the seating," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A rather obvious one." She didn't look at Imani directly, instead speaking about her as if she were a piece of misplaced luggage. I fly this route twice a month. I know the regulars. It's just highly unusual. I'm sure you understand. Chloe looked from the imperious woman to the calm, composed figure of Imani Jackson. The young flight attendant was caught in a classic dilemma, a demanding high-status passenger on one side, and a situation she was clearly not trained to handle on the other. Imani let out a quiet, internal sigh. Her sanctuary was about to be breached. Imani decided to meet the situation head-on, her voice steady and devoid of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. "Is there a problem with my seat, miss?" she asked, her gaze locking with Eleanor Vance's. Eleanor was finally forced to address her directly. She gave a performative little laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, not a problem with the seat, dear. A problem with who is in it. These international first-class seats are often reserved for our most loyal customers. Executive Platinum, Concierge Key, that sort of thing. Sometimes when there's a last-minute equipment change, the system makes errors. Upgrades get processed incorrectly. It happens." The subtext was as thick as the clouds they would soon be flying through. "You don't belong here. You couldn't have possibly paid for this. You must be a mistake." "My boarding pass says 2A," Imani stated simply, refusing to be drawn into a debate about her status or her finances. "I can assure you there's no mistake." "Well, I'm a Diamond Medallion member with this airline's partner alliance," Eleanor retorted, puffing up her chest slightly, as if the title were a military rank. "And my husband, Charles Vance of Vance Capital, is on your board's advisory council. I am very familiar with the protocols." "Chloe," she said, turning her attention back to the flustered flight attendant, "I really must insist you get the purser. This needs to be sorted before we push back from the gate." Chloe looked helplessly at Imani, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, granting her permission to fetch a superior. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a challenge, a public questioning of her legitimacy. Every other passenger in the small cabin was now pretending not to listen. Their newspapers held a little too high, their focus on their screens a little too intense. A few minutes later, a man in his late 40s with a weary expression and a slightly rumpled uniform appeared. His name tag read Mark. He was the flight's purser. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," he said with a practiced, tired smile. "Chloe tells me there's some concern about the seating." "Mark, thank you for coming," Eleanor said, her tone shifting to one of an adult addressing a competent peer. "As I was explaining, I'm almost certain there's been a computer glitch. This passenger," she said, again using the detached term, gesturing toward Imani, "is in 2A. My colleague from our London office, Mr. Abernathy, was supposed to be in that seat. He's a million-miler. I saw him at the gate and he was complaining about being bumped. It seems rather clear what's happened." This was a new, more elaborate fabrication. Imani's mind, trained to detect deception in high-stakes negotiations, recognized the tactic instantly. Eleanor was building a plausible, if entirely false, narrative. Mark turned to Imani, his expression a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes held a plea. "Please don't make this difficult." "Ma'am, could I please see your boarding pass?" he asked. Imani calmly retrieved her phone, pulled up the digital pass and handed it to him. The screen glowed with her name, Dr. Imani Jackson, and the bold letters, "Seat 2A, First Class." Mark scanned it. "Everything seems to be in order here, Mrs. Vance. Dr. Jackson is assigned to this seat." He handed the phone back to Imani. Eleanor scoffed. "The glitch would be in your system, Mark, not on her phone. Anyone can have a convincing-looking app. Did you check her against the official manifest? Did you cross-reference it with the gate agent's list? It's a simple matter of confirming her ticket stock. A non-revenue passenger or a last-minute low-tier upgrade would be coded differently." The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. Eleanor Vance was throwing around industry jargon to intimidate and assert her dominance, painting Imani as either a freeloader or a fraud. Mark's patience was visibly thinning. The call to close the cabin door was imminent, and he was now caught between a powerful, complaining passenger and the risk of a delay, which would mean a mountain of paperwork. He made a choice, the path of least resistance. "Dr. Jackson," he began, his tone shifting from neutral to placating. "I understand this is your assigned seat, and I'm not disputing that. However, to ensure a timely departure and to resolve this confusion, would you be willing to accept a seat in our business class cabin? It's still very comfortable. And of course, we would refund the fare difference and offer you a travel voucher for the inconvenience." The entire cabin was now openly staring. The pretense was over. Imani's calm demeanor hardened into something steely and immovable. She had been polite. She had been patient. But this was a line she would not allow to be crossed. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about her dignity. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, her voice dropping but gaining an intensity that made both Mark and Chloe take a step back. "I purchased this ticket. This is my seat. I have presented my valid boarding pass. The confusion seems to be entirely on the part of Mrs. Vance. I will not be moving. I will not be downgraded. And I will not be bribed with a voucher to soothe the prejudices of another passenger. We are done with this conversation. Please prepare the cabin for takeoff." Her words hung in the air, a sharp, clear indictment of the entire situation. Mark's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Eleanor Vance looked utterly scandalized, as if a piece of furniture had just talked back to her. "Well, I never," Eleanor gasped. "The nerve. Mark, are you going to allow her to speak to me that way? She is being disruptive." Mark saw his easy way out dissolving. He was losing control of the cabin. He looked at Imani, who sat there resolute and unmoving, a pillar of defiance. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was now dialing up the melodrama. He made another choice, a worse one. "Ma'am," he said to Imani, his voice now cold and official, "your refusal to cooperate is interfering with the duties of a flight crew. If you will not move, I will have to call the captain." Imani simply raised an eyebrow. "Then call him." The jet bridge was still attached to the aircraft, a metal umbilical cord connecting the plane to the terminal, but the main cabin door had been closed. The air inside the first-class section was thick with a tension that no air filtration system could purify. Every passenger was a spectator in a drama they hadn't chosen to watch. The purser, Mark, disappeared into the cockpit. Moments later, he returned, followed by Captain Alan Miller. The captain was a man who looked the part, silver hair, a square jaw, and an air of unflappable authority that came from decades of command. He surveyed the scene, his eyes briefly flicking over Eleanor Vance's theatrical distress before settling on Imani, who remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "Good evening," Captain Miller said, his voice a low baritone meant to project immediate control. "I'm Captain Miller. I understand we have a seating dispute." "It's hardly a dispute, Captain," Eleanor interjected immediately, seizing the opportunity to frame the narrative. "It is a security concern. This person has refused to verify her credentials, has become belligerent with your staff, and is refusing a reasonable request to de-escalate the situation. For all we know, her ticket could be fraudulent. I, for one, do not feel safe." It was a masterful, poisonous escalation. She had moved from mistake to disruptive, and now to security concern, using the buzzwords of a post-9/11 world to weaponize her complaint. Captain Miller looked at Imani, his face unreadable. "Ma'am, my purser has informed me that you are unwilling to cooperate. We have a schedule to keep. Our takeoff window is closing. I need this situation resolved now." "Captain," Imani replied, her tone respectful but firm, matching his level of authority. "I have cooperated fully. I showed your purser my valid boarding pass for seat 2A. I have not been belligerent. I have simply refused to relinquish my rightfully purchased seat based on the unfounded accusations of another passenger. The only person causing a disruption is Mrs. Vance. The only one refusing to accept a verifiable fact is your purser." She was logical. She was precise, and that, in this absurd theater, was her biggest problem. Her refusal to be emotional or flustered was being interpreted as cold, uncooperative defiance. Captain Miller listened. but his mind was already calculating variables that had nothing to do with justice. He was thinking about departure times, fuel consumption on the tarmac, and the potential for a cascading series of delays across the entire transatlantic network. He was weighing the complaint of a high-value, well-connected passenger against an unknown quantity. And he, like Mark, chose the path of least resistance. "I don't have time to litigate this, ma'am," he said, his voice hardening. "The purser, under my authority, has given you a lawful instruction. We have offered you an alternative. Your refusal to comply now makes you a non-compliant passenger. I am ordering you to vacate your seat and come with us." Imani felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was it, the final irreversible step. She had played by every rule, maintained her composure, and presented the facts. It hadn't mattered. The system embodied by these three individuals, Chloe's fear, Mark's cynicism, and Miller's expediency, was bending to the will of prejudice. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Then you will be removed from my aircraft," the captain stated flatly, "and you may be met by law enforcement." The threat hung in the air, ugly and final, to be forcibly removed, to be paraded out in front of all these strangers. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave of shame and anger that she had to fight to control. She thought about the deal she'd just closed. She thought about the new job waiting for her in London, a position of immense power and responsibility. She thought about the irony of it all. In the boardroom, her mind was her weapon. Here, in this cabin, she had been rendered powerless, judged not by her intellect or character, but by a narrative she had no part in writing. Slowly, deliberately, Imani unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was unnaturally loud in the silent cabin. She stood up, her movements graceful and unhurried. She looked at Eleanor Vance, whose face was a mask of triumphant vindication. She looked at the purser, Mark, who refused to meet her eyes. She looked at Captain Miller, who stood there, a stony-faced executioner of convenience. Without a word, she reached up and retrieved her leather briefcase from the overhead compartment. She smoothed down her blazer, took a deep breath, and turned to walk toward the front of the plane. Her head was held high. Every eye was on her, a mixture of pity, discomfort, and for a few, quiet contempt. It was a walk of shame she had done nothing to earn. As she reached the galley, Mark moved to escort her. "I can find the door myself," she said, her voice cutting through his attempt at professional courtesy. She stepped out of the aircraft and onto the jet bridge. The cool, stale air of the terminal felt foreign after the climate-controlled cabin. The door to the airplane hissed shut behind her, a sound of finality, sealing her out. The public humiliation was complete, or so they thought. Back in the terminal at the deserted Gate C-42, the two gate agents, a woman named Maria and a younger man named Ben, looked up in surprise as Imani walked toward them, escorted by a tight-lipped Mark. The jet bridge retracted from the aircraft with a hydraulic groan. "There was a seating issue," Mark said curtly, handing Maria a slip of paper. "She'll need to be rebooked." He avoided looking at Imani, eager to wash his hands of the whole affair and get back to his duties. He turned and disappeared back onto the plane without another word. Maria, the gate supervisor, sighed. Rebooking was a nightmare, especially for a full international flight. "Okay, ma'am, let's see what we can do. I might be able to get you on the 11 p.m. flight, but it will probably be an economy." Imani didn't answer. She wasn't looking at Maria. She simply stood for a moment, her briefcase in hand, the picture of serene composure. The anger, the humiliation. It was all still there, but it was being channeled, compressed into a single point of cold, clear purpose. She set her briefcase down, opened it, and took out her phone. Ben, the younger agent, watched her with a flicker of sympathy. "Tough break," he offered. "Some of those frequent flyers can be real." He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Imani gave him a small, sad smile. Yes, they can. She scrolled through her contacts, bypassing her lawyer, bypassing her executive assistant. She went to a name saved simply as R. Sterling. She pressed the call button. Maria was already typing furiously at her keyboard, trying to pull up booking options. "Okay, Dr. Jackson, I see your original ticket. Looks like... Oh, wow. That's a full-fare first-class ticket, very flexible. That makes things easier." She looked up. "Why on earth did they remove you?" Imani held up a single finger, asking for a moment of silence as the call connected. "This is Sterling," a powerful, no-nonsense voice answered on the first ring. "Richard, it's Imani Jackson," she said, her voice calm and even. On the other end of the line, Richard Sterling, the chief executive officer of American Airlines, sat up straighter in the back of his car, which was speeding him away from a charity dinner in Manhattan. "Imani, I thought you'd be in the air by now. Is everything all right? Don't tell me the merger hit a last-minute snag." "The merger is fine, Richard. My travel plans, however, are not," she said. "I'm calling you from Gate C-42 at JFK. I've just been removed from Flight 110 to Heathrow." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. "Removed? What are you talking about? Did you miss the flight?" "No. I was in my assigned seat, 2A. A passenger and Eleanor Vance decided I didn't belong there. She involved the flight crew, who escalated it to the captain. The captain, a Mr. Miller, ultimately decided that I was being uncooperative and ordered me off the aircraft." She recounted the events with the detached precision of a lawyer presenting a case. The accusations, the refusal to check the manifest properly, the offer of a bribe, the final threat. She left out the emotion, focusing only on the operational and procedural failures. As she spoke, Maria and Ben had stopped typing. They were staring at her, their mouths slightly agape. The name Richard Sterling was to them akin to hearing a parish priest mention he was on a first-name basis with the Pope. "Let me get this straight." Richard Sterling's voice boomed through the phone, now laced with cold fury. "My new executive vice president of global operations, the woman I just hired to overhaul our entire customer experience and international logistics, was just kicked off one of our flagship flights because of a complaint from another passenger." The pieces clicked into place for Maria and Ben at the exact same moment. Their eyes widened in horror. Executive vice president. This wasn't just a disgruntled passenger. This was senior leadership. This was the woman who, in a week's time, would be their boss's boss's boss. "That is the correct assessment of the situation, Richard," Imani confirmed. "The jet bridge, has it already pulled back?" Sterling demanded. "It has," Imani said. "They are preparing for pushback as we speak." "Tell them not to," Sterling commanded. "Give your phone to the gate supervisor. Now." Imani held the phone out to Maria, who took it as if it were a live grenade. "Hello?" she stammered. "This is Richard Sterling, CEO of American Airlines," the voice on the phone said, leaving no room for doubt. "What is your name?" "Maria Flores, sir." "Maria, listen to me very carefully. You are to get on the radio to the cockpit of Flight 110 immediately. You will inform Captain Miller that he is to hold his position by order of the CEO. He is not to move that aircraft an inch. He is to reattach the jet bridge and open the door. Is that understood?" Yes, sir." Maria was already fumbling for her radio, her hands trembling. "After you have done that, you will inform Dr. Jackson that I am on my way. My car is 20 minutes from JFK. We will be handling this personally. Is that also understood?" "Perfectly, sir. Absolutely." "Good." The line went dead. Maria looked at Imani, her face pale with a mixture of awe and terror. Ben looked like he'd seen a ghost. The quiet, humiliated woman who had walked off that plane just 5 minutes ago had transformed before their eyes. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a threat. She had simply made a phone call. And with that one call, she had stopped a 200-ton Boeing 777 in its tracks. The balance of power had just shifted, and an earthquake was about to rip through the cabin of Flight 110. On board Flight 110, a sense of uneasy relief had settled over the first-class cabin. Eleanor Vance was accepting a glass of champagne from a still-shaken Chloe. a smug little smile playing on her lips. She had won. She had restored the natural order of things. The purser, Mark, was rushing through the final cabin checks, trying to make up for lost time. In the cockpit, Captain Miller was going through his pre-flight checklist, already mentally drafting the incident report that would justify his decision and the minor delay. Then the radio crackled. It was the voice of Maria from the gate, strained and urgent. "Tower to AA-110. Captain Miller, do you copy?" Miller keyed the mic. "Go ahead, Tower." "Sir, by direct order of the CEO, you are to hold your position. I repeat, hold your position. Do not push back. Reattach the jet bridge to the main cabin door and await further instruction." A stunned silence filled the cockpit. The first officer stared at Miller, who blinked in disbelief. An order from the CEO? In his 30 years of flying, he had never heard of such a thing. It was an unprecedented breach of protocol. The CEO didn't get involved in gate operations. "Tower, can you repeat that?" Miller asked, his voice tight. "On whose authority?" "On the authority of Mr. Richard Sterling, sir." Maria's voice crackled back, with an added note of panic. "He's on his way to the gate. Please, Captain, reattach the bridge." A cold dread began to seep into Miller's bones. This was no longer about a disruptive passenger. This was something else entirely, something big. He had made a calculation, and he was suddenly gripped by the terrifying feeling that his math had been catastrophically wrong. "Reattach the jet bridge," he ordered the ground crew, his voice grim. Back in the cabin, the passengers murmured in confusion as the heavy machinery of the jet bridge whirred back to life and sealed itself against the aircraft with a solid thud. Mark and Chloe exchanged a worried glance. Why were they reopening? Did the removed passenger have a medical emergency? Then, the main cabin door was opened by Mark, revealing the anxious face of Maria, the gate agent. She beckoned him out onto the bridge. "What is going on?" Mark demanded. Maria was pale. "The woman you removed, do you know who she is?" "A full-fare passenger named Jackson. Why?" "Her name is Dr. Imani Jackson," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. "She's the new executive VP of Global Operations. She starts next week." That was the CEO on the phone, Richard Sterling. "He's on his way here." He ordered the plane stopped. The color drained from Mark's face. Every drop of professional cynicism, every bit of jaded detachment he had built up over the years, evaporated in a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. He thought of his condescending tone, his offer of a voucher, his threat to call the captain. He felt physically ill. He stumbled back into the galley, leaning against a counter for support. Chloe saw his expression and knew something was terribly wrong. "Mark, what is it?" "The passenger," he choked out. "The woman we removed. She's the new EVP." Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. She thought of her own role, her nervousness that had allowed Eleanor Vance to bully her into escalating the situation. She felt her career, just barely begun, crumbling into dust. Mark walked zombie-like into the cockpit and delivered the news to Captain Miller. The captain's face, already grim, turned to stone. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white. He had gambled on expediency and lost everything. He, a decorated captain with decades of seniority, had followed the lead of a complaining passenger, and in doing so, had publicly humiliated one of the most powerful executives in the entire company. The 20 minutes that followed were the longest of their lives. A paralyzing silence fell over the crew. They could only wait. In the cabin, Eleanor Vance was beginning to feel a prickle of annoyance. This new delay was unacceptable. She was about to complain again when she noticed the ashen faces of the flight attendants. She saw them whispering to each other, occasionally glancing her way with looks of pure terror. For the first time, a seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. Who was that woman? At the gate, Imani sat calmly in a chair Maria had provided, sipping a bottle of water. She didn't speak. She just waited. She knew Richard Sterling. He was a man of action, a leader who understood that a company's culture was defined not by its mission statement, but by what it did when things went wrong. Finally, a stir at the end of the terminal announced his arrival. Richard Sterling, flanked by 2 airport security officials and the JFK station manager, strode toward the gate with a thunderous expression. He was a tall, imposing man, and he moved with the furious energy of a person whose time was being wasted and whose principles had been violated. He walked directly to Imani, his face softening slightly. "Imani, I am so sorry. I am beyond appalled." "Thank you for coming, Richard," she said simply. He nodded, then turned to the assembled staff at the gate. His gaze was like ice. "Is the jet bridge secure?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling," the station manager squeaked. "Good," Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous. "Dr. Jackson and I are about to get back on that plane." The walk back down the jet bridge was a procession of silent, thunderous power. The metallic corridor, usually a mundane transitional space, felt like the Green Mile for the careers of those waiting on the other side. Richard Sterling walked with a purpose that seemed to propel him forward, his polished dress shoes echoing a funereal rhythm on the grated floor. He wasn't rushing. His pace was deliberate, measured, the stride of a man who knows the outcome is already decided and is merely carrying out the sentence. Beside him, Imani Jackson matched his pace. Her earlier composure had been a shield. This was different. This was a quiet, unyielding strength, her expression serene but her eyes holding the focused intensity of a master strategist about to execute a final, decisive move. Trailing a few paces behind them, the JFK station manager and the gate supervisor, Maria, followed like silent acolytes in a ritual they didn't fully understand but were terrified to disrupt. At the aircraft door, the newly promoted purser, David, stood guard. He saw the approaching party through the small porthole window, and his eyes widened. He fumbled for a moment before pulling the heavy door inward, opening it with a quiet whoosh of recycled air. He flattened himself against the bulkhead as if to take up as little space as possible. "Mr. Sterling, sir. Dr. Jackson," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Richard Sterling gave him a curt nod, his gaze already fixed down the length of the first-class aisle. He and Imani stepped across the threshold, and as they did, a wave of absolute silence washed over the cabin. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit suddenly seemed deafening. Every passenger, those who had been feigning sleep and those who were openly whispering, froze. Heads turned, newspapers were lowered, phone screens went dark. They saw Imani first, the woman they had watched being escorted off in disgrace. But the woman who returned was not the same. She was flanked by a man whose expensive suit and aura of command were unmistakable. The power dynamic had not merely shifted, it had undergone a cataclysmic reversal. Captain Alan Miller had emerged from the cockpit, his face a grim, stony mask. The purser, Mark, stood beside him in the galley, his posture rigid, his skin a pasty, sickly white. They looked like statues awaiting a lightning strike. Sterling and Imani began their slow walk down the aisle. The other passengers instinctively shrank back in their seats, their discomfort and awe a palpable force in the air. Their eyes followed the duo until they came to a stop directly in front of seat 2D, where Eleanor Vance was seated. She had been sipping her champagne, her previous victory soured by the inexplicable delay. Seeing Imani return, her first reaction was a flash of indignant fury. How dare they? But her anger dissolved into confusion, and then a prickle of cold fear as she took in the sight of the imposing man by Imani's side. She lowered her champagne flute to its coaster with a soft clink. Richard Sterling stood there for a long moment, simply looking down at her, allowing the weight of the silence to press in. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the cabin with absolute authority. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance?" he asked, the question a mere formality. Eleanor, attempting to rally her customary sense of superiority, lifted her chin. "Yes, and may I ask who is responsible for this further delay? This is completely unacceptable." "I am responsible," Sterling stated flatly. He let the words hang in the air for a beat. "My name is Richard Sterling. I am the chief executive officer of this airline." If a bomb had been detonated in the cabin, the effect could not have been more profound. A collective, sharp intake of breath was audible. The man in 3A who had spoken to Imani simply stared, his mouth agape. Eleanor Vance's carefully applied makeup could not hide the sudden, shocking loss of all color from her face. Her arrogance evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The name Vance Capital, the diamond medallion status, all the sources of her power, were nothing compared to the man standing before her. "I was made aware just a short while ago," Sterling continued, his tone turning from informational to glacial, "of a severe incident of passenger misconduct that occurred on this flight prior to departure. An incident in which you, Mrs. Vance, initiated a baseless and sustained campaign of harassment against another passenger." "No, that's not. It was a misunderstanding," she sputtered, her voice losing its crisp aristocratic edge and becoming thin and reedy. "I simply thought there had been a mistake with the seating." "There was no mistake with the seating," Sterling interrupted, his voice sharp, dismissing her excuse as the pathetic lie it was. "There was, however, a mistake in judgment, a catastrophic one. You used your frequent flyer status and your husband's name not as a customer, but as a cudgel. You bullied my crew. You refused to accept verifiable proof. You made false and inflammatory accusations, escalating from a mistake to a security concern in a deliberate attempt to have a passenger removed from a seat she rightfully occupied. You did all of this, it seems, because you made an assumption about her based on a prejudice you hold. In doing so, you have poisoned the atmosphere of this cabin and violated the most basic principles of decency this airline stands for." His indictment was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor's closing argument. He then paused, turning his head slightly to gesture toward the woman standing calmly by his side. "You see, Mrs. Vance, you didn't just harass a passenger. You fundamentally misunderstood who you were dealing with. Allow me to introduce you properly. This is Dr. Imani Jackson." He paused again, letting the name settle. He looked directly into Eleanor's terrified eyes. "As of next Monday, Dr. Jackson will assume her new role as this company's Executive Vice President of Global Operations. She is the senior leader to whom the entire international division, including the pilots, the cabin crew, and the very loyalty programs you hold so dear, will ultimately report." The words landed like hammer blows. A low murmur rippled through the passengers. This was no longer just karma. This was Shakespearean. Eleanor Vance's world visibly tilted on its axis. She stared at Imani, the woman she had dismissed as an error, a piece of misplaced human luggage, and finally saw her for who she was, the new queen of the very kingdom where Eleanor had, until moments ago, been a minor duchess. The irony was so potent, so devastating, it was almost poetic. "Our company's policies on discrimination and harassment are not suggestions, Mrs. Vance. They are bedrock," Sterling said, his voice now devoid of all warmth. "And status is a reward for loyalty and partnership, not a license for abuse. Therefore, I am informing you personally that your diamond medallion status is revoked. Your advantage account will be terminated. All accumulated miles will be forfeited. This revocation is permanent, and it will be honored across our entire One World alliance. You are, in effect, banned from this airline and our partners for life." Eleanor made a small, choking sound. Her entire identity as a traveler, a source of immense pride and privilege, had just been vaporized. "Furthermore," Sterling pressed on, offering no quarter, "your actions have directly led to the delay of an international flight and the potential for a federal incident. You have two choices. You may gather your personal belongings now and deplane with the airport official who is waiting for you at the door. You will do this quietly and without protest. Your second choice is to refuse, at which point I will instruct Captain Miller to formally charge you with interference with a flight crew, a federal crime that carries severe penalties. The choice is yours. But your journey with us ends tonight. Here. Now." Utterly defeated, Eleanor Vance began to tremble, her body finally succumbing to the shock. The mask of haughty indignation had crumbled, revealing the pathetic, frightened woman beneath. Silent tears of pure, impotent rage and humiliation streamed down her cheeks. carving paths through her expensive foundation. She fumbled clumsily for her purse and her cashmere wrap, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She could not, look at Imani as she rose from her seat. She was a ghost, a non-entity. Escorted by a stoic airport security officer who had stepped onto the plane, she performed her own walk of shame, a silent, excruciating journey past the staring eyes of the passengers who had witnessed her hubris and were now witnessing her fall. Once she was gone and the cabin door was once again sealed, Richard Sterling turned his steely gaze upon his crew. "Captain Miller, Mark," he said, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. "Be in my office at headquarters at 0800 tomorrow. You are both suspended from all duties, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. A replacement crew will meet this flight in London. Now, I suggest you get this aircraft to its destination." Without waiting for a reply, he turned to the rest of the passengers. His entire demeanor softened, shifting from prosecutor to leader. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire airline, I offer my most sincere and profound apologies. You should never have been witness to such an event. This is not who we are, and I give you my personal assurance that the failures that allowed this to happen will be rectified. We will be better." Finally, he turned to Imani. The authority in his face was replaced by a look of genuine regret and respect. "Dr. Jackson, Imani, I am truly deeply sorry. Welcome aboard." "Thank you for handling this, Richard," she replied, her voice steady. He gave her a final, meaningful nod, then turned and deplaned. The door hissed shut for the last time. The engines began to spool up with a rising whine. Imani Jackson walked the final few steps to seat 2A and settled into the plush leather. The space was the same, but its significance had been irrevocably transformed. It was no longer a contested territory, but a throne she had rightfully claimed, not just by ticket, but by character. The flight to London was finally truly underway. The ascent of the Boeing 777 was, as always, a marvel of controlled power. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it sliced through the lower cloud layers, then settled into a serene, impossibly smooth glide as it reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Below, the lights of Long Island were a fading constellation, a final farewell from the world where, less than an hour ago, Imani Jackson had been subjected to a profound and public humiliation. Up here in the stratosphere, there was a surreal peace. But inside the first-class cabin of Flight 110, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. It was a vacuum sealed with unspoken words, awkward glances, and the palpable tension of the recent drama. The original flight crew, Chloe, Mark, and Captain Miller, were ghosts, their presence lingering in the crew's ashen faces and the overly cautious movements of their replacements. A man named David, a kind-faced senior attendant hastily promoted to purser from the business-class cabin, approached Imani's seat. He moved with a reverence one might reserve for royalty or a temperamental deity. "Dr. Jackson," he began, his voice a low, respectful murmur. "May I get you anything at all? A drink? The dinner service will be starting shortly. We have a pan-seared halibut or a filet mignon." He trailed off, his professional script seeming utterly inadequate for the moment. Imani looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped back on the plane, she offered a small, genuine smile. She saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate plea to get this interaction right. He was not Mark. He was not complicit. He was simply a man trying to do his job in the middle of a corporate earthquake. "The halibut sounds wonderful, David. Thank you," she said, her voice gentle. "And I would love a glass of the Sancerre if you have it." The relief that washed over David's face was so profound it was almost comical. "Of course, right away, Dr. Jackson." As he scurried off, Imani felt the first real pang of the emotional aftermath. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was a deep, resonant ache. The humiliation had been real. The stares, the whispers, Eleanor Vance's smug satisfaction. They were barbs that had found their mark. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the sting. She was not just a title on a business card. She was a black woman who had been told in no uncertain terms that her presence was a mistake. It was a narrative she had fought against her entire life. In every classroom, every boardroom, every space where she was the first or the only one. She had built a fortress of achievement and grace around herself, but the old, ugly poison had still found a way to seep through the cracks. The passenger in seat 3A, a man who had watched the entire affair with a stony expression, caught her eye. He leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said quietly. I wanted to say that what happened back there was disgraceful. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Imani nodded, appreciating the gesture. "Thank you." "I should have said something," the man confessed, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "We all should have, but it all happened so fast and she was, well, he didn't need to finish. She was a powerful white woman, and you didn't want to get involved." "I understand," Imani said, and she truly did. She understood the paralysis of the bystander, the instinct to avoid confrontation. And in that moment, she realized the problem was even bigger than she'd thought. The sickness wasn't just in the aggressor or the staff who enabled her. It was in the silence of the good people who stood by and watched. She turned her gaze to the window, looking out at the velvet blackness of the night sky, sprinkled with the diamond dust of distant stars. The plane felt like a tiny, fragile vessel in an infinite, indifferent universe. But inside this vessel, a microcosm of the world, a fundamental failure had occurred, a failure of decency, of protocol, of courage. And that was when the transition happened. The ache in her chest began to cool, solidifying from a hot liquid pain into the cold, hard steel of resolve. Richard Sterling had hired her to fix the airline's global operations, to streamline logistics, to maximize efficiency, to increase profits. He thought he was hiring a brilliant corporate strategist. He was. But this incident had handed her a new, more urgent mission. You couldn't fix the operations of a company until you had first fixed its soul. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a warm, steady presence from years past. He had been a history professor, a man who saw the world in long, sweeping arcs. "Injustice is a current, Imani," he used to tell her. "It will always try to pull you under. You can fight it and you'll get tired. You can rage at it and you'll lose your voice. Or you can learn to build a dam, divert the water, and use its own power to create something new." She would not just be a victim of this incident. She would be its architect of change. She would build a dam. Reaching down, she unlatched her leather briefcase. The familiar clicks of the locks were decisive, punctuating the silence. This case had carried the documents for multi-billion-dollar mergers, but the work she was about to do felt infinitely more valuable. She bypassed the dense folders of financial projections and market analyses and pulled out a fresh, empty legal pad and a weighty fountain pen. She uncapped the pen, its gold nib gleaming in the soft cabin light. At the top of the crisp yellow page, she wrote 2 words: Project Dignity. This would not be a memo. It would be a manifesto. Her mind, honed by decades of complex problem-solving, began to dissect the evening's failure, not as a personal affront, but as a series of cascading system breakdowns. Each breakdown required a corresponding solution, a structural reinforcement to ensure it could never happen again. First, she wrote, empowerment over appeasement. The core failure was that the crew, from Chloe to Captain Miller, felt that appeasing the aggressor was a safer choice than defending the victim. Why? Because Eleanor Vance represented status, revenue, and connections. Imani to them was an unknown variable, and thus a risk. The entire incentive structure was backward. This led to her first initiative, which she named the Captain's Call. It would be a complete from-the-ground-up overhaul of crew training. No more sterile, check-the-box online modules about diversity. This would be immersive, scenario-based training, likely using advanced VR technology to simulate the intense pressure of real-life confrontations. She envisioned scenarios just like the one she had experienced. The training would teach employees to identify and trust verifiable facts, a boarding pass, a ticket record, over the emotional narrative of a belligerent passenger. It would feature de-escalation training not designed to placate, but to control and neutralize a threat to the cabin's decorum and safety. Crucially, she would bake in a new radical protocol, the dignity veto. Any crew member from the newest flight attendant to the captain would be authorized to issue a formal warning to a harassing passenger. A second infraction would trigger the veto, a non-negotiable process for having that passenger removed, with the full backing of the corporate office regardless of their frequent flyer status. It would protect the Chloes of the world, giving them a shield where before they had only had fear. It would shift the risk calculation entirely. The risk would no longer be in confronting prejudice but in failing to. Second, she wrote, principle over privilege. Eleanor Vance had weaponized her status. The system was designed to listen to voices like hers more loudly than others. This needed to be dismantled. She began to outline a new passenger code of conduct, moving away from the vague language of unruly behavior to a clear, explicit set of principles. It would be called the Community of Respect Compact. It would be a part of the terms and conditions every passenger agreed to upon ticketing. It would state in simple terms that every person on the aircraft was entitled to travel free from harassment and discrimination. To enforce it, she designed a two-pronged approach. Complaints against passengers would no longer be handled by gate agents or pursers caught in the heat of the moment. They would be routed to a new independent passenger conduct review board at the corporate level, a body trained to investigate impartially. Furthermore, she toyed with a more radical idea, a confidential passenger conduct score. Similar to a credit score, it would track a passenger's history. A record of validated complaints for abusive or discriminatory behavior would lower one's score, potentially leading to a loss of status, suspension of flying privileges, or an outright ban. The system of rewards had created Eleanor. A system of consequences would prevent her successor. Third, she wrote, observation over assumption. The crew had assumed Eleanor was credible, and she was not. They had no objective data. The airline was flying blind, only ever hearing about problems after they had exploded. This inspired her third initiative, which she would call the Wayfinder program. She rejected the cold corporate term auditor. Wayfinders would be the airline's conscience. They would be a select group of employees from every level of the company: pilots, baggage handlers, reservation agents, corporate staff, chosen for their integrity and observational skills. They would fly on routes across the globe, incognito as regular passengers. Their job would not be to punish, but to observe and report. They would highlight exemplary service for rewards and recognition, and they would identify the subtle systemic cracks in the culture. The purser who sighs when a non-English speaker asks a question, the gate agent who is dismissive of a family with young children, the crew that allows a high-status passenger to bend the rules. Their detailed reports would provide a real-time, ground-level view of the company's cultural health, allowing leadership to spot and fix problems long before they escalated into another Flight 110 disaster. The plane flew on through the night as Imani filled page after page. The dinner service came and went. The cabin lights dimmed. Other passengers slept. But Imani was wide awake, fueled by a purpose so clear and bright it felt like a second sun. She was not just drafting corporate policy. She was codifying her own life experience. She was taking the countless small cuts, the subtle dismissals, the overt aggressions she had endured over a lifetime, and she was forging them into a shield for others. As the first faint hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, a delicate violet line separating the dark sea from the dark sky, Imani put down her pen. The legal pad was filled with notes, diagrams, and action items. Project Dignity was no longer an idea. It was a blueprint. She looked out the window at the nascent sunrise. The flight to London was nearly over, but her real work, the most important work of her career, was just about to begin. The humiliation she had felt was a bitter price to pay, But as she watched the new day being born, she knew she had successfully diverted the current. She was going to use its power to create something new, and the entire airline industry would never be the same. This story, though a dramatic retelling, is inspired by countless real incidents where prejudice and privilege collide in public spaces. It serves as a powerful reminder that a person's worth is not determined by the class of their ticket, the color of their skin, or the assumptions of others. Imani's story is a testament to the power of maintaining one's dignity in the face of disrespect and the incredible change that can happen when the right person is in a position to act. Karma, in this case, wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a better, more equitable system for everyone. Have you ever witnessed an injustice you wish you could have changed? What would you have done in Imani's, or even Chloe's, situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that need to be told. Thank you for listening.